Three women checked into a motel near Yosemite National Park on a Monday evening in February 1999. By Tuesday morning, they were gone. No argument overheard, no struggle reported. No one saw them leave. Just an empty room, an unmade bed, and a rental car that nobody could find. For weeks, investigators searched. They interviewed motel employees, canvassed the area, chased leads in other towns. One of those employees, a handyman who lived on the property, sat down with the FBI and answered their questions without raising a single red flag. His name was Cary Stayner. The FBI would interview him again, and again after that. They would eventually ask him to help collect evidence from the motel where the women had been staying. He agreed. He was cooperative, calm, and completely off their radar. This episode contains descriptions of murder, sexual violence, and crimes against minors. Viewer discretion is advised. Yosemite National Park draws 4 million visitors a year. It is one of the most photographed places on Earth. Granite cliffs, ancient sequoias, waterfalls that drop 1,000 feet into open air. People come here to feel small in the best possible way. Cedar Lodge sits 7 miles from the park's western gate, on a stretch of Highway 140 that follows the Merced River through a canyon of pine and rock. It is the kind of place you stop for a night on your way to somewhere magnificent. Carole Sund had stopped there before. To understand how Cary Stayner became capable of what he did in that motel, and what he would go on to do 5 months later, deeper inside the park, you have to understand the family he came from, the losses they suffered, the attention that came with those losses, and the boy who stood at the edge of all of it, watching for 30 years, until he couldn't anymore. Merced sits at the southern end of California's Central Valley, surrounded by almond groves and peach orchards, an hour and a half east of San Francisco and roughly 2 hours from the western gate of Yosemite National Park. People there call it the gateway to Yosemite. It is the kind of town where nothing much happens, and for the Stayner family, parents Delbert and Kay, 5 children, a modest house on a quiet street, that was the whole point. Cary Anthony Stayner was born on August 13, 1961, the eldest. By the accounts of childhood friends, he was a gentle older brother, protective of Stephen, 4 years his junior. They rode bikes together, skateboarded at the park, spent their summers the way boys in Central Valley farming towns spent summers. One classmate remembered him as a quiet guy. Another said he genuinely loved his brother. He was also, even then, quietly struggling. At the age of 3, Cary was diagnosed with trichotillomania, a compulsive disorder that caused him to pull out his own hair. He was put on medication, but the condition persisted into his high school years, leaving visible bald patches that made him a target for bullying. He wore a baseball cap every day. He never took it off. Beneath the cap, a boy who was intelligent, placed in accelerated classes by his teachers, and creative enough that his cartoon contributions to the school newspaper earned him the most creative distinction in his graduating class at Merced High School. Bright, artistic, and profoundly alone. He later admitted to investigators that he had begun fantasizing about killing women at age 7, before Stephen was taken, before the cameras came, before any of it. Whatever was forming inside Cary Stayner had already begun. The family tragedy that followed didn't create it, it just gave it more room. Because on December 4, 1972, the explanation arrived anyway. 7-year-old Stephen Stayner was walking home from school when he was approached by a man named Irvin Edward Murphy. Murphy told him he was collecting money for his church and offered the boy a ride home. Stephen agreed, but Kenneth Parnell was waiting in the car. Parnell was a convicted sex offender who worked as a night auditor at the Yosemite Lodge, 2 hours from the Stayner home. He took Stephen to a cabin in Kathy's-Downey, molested him that night, and told the 7-year-old that his family no longer wanted him, that Parnell was adopting him. He even staged a phone call from Stephen's mother to make the child believe it. Stephen didn't come home for 7 years. The search that followed was enormous and produced nothing. Merced police mounted a large effort, and there was simply nothing there. The family fractured quietly, the way families do when grief has nowhere to go. Cary was 11 years old. He later said he felt invisible, not because his parents didn't love him, but because they were consumed by the loss of a child, and the child who remained had no script for that. One friend remembered hearing that Cary used to go outside at night
and wish on a star that Stephen would come home. Then, in March 1980, Stephen did come home.
He was 14 by then, and had spent 7 years being moved around California by Parnell under a false name, Dennis Parnell, attending schools, performing well, building something like a life in the wreckage of the one he'd been taken from. When Parnell abducted a 5-year-old named Timothy White and brought the boy home, Stephen made a decision. He waited until Parnell was at work, took Timothy, and hitchhiked to a police station in Ukiah. His statement to police contained one of the most memorable lines in the history of American missing children's cases. "I know my first name is Stephen." The nation embraced him. Television cameras descended on the Stayner front lawn. There were press conferences, morning show appearances, magazine covers. And in every photograph from that reunion, there is Cary in his baseball cap, standing at the edge of the crowd, not smiling. Parnell was convicted on kidnapping and false imprisonment charges. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison but served only 5, less time than he had held Stephen captive. There was fury over the sentence. And then there was the long grind and aftermath. Stephen trying to relearn how to be part of a family, struggling in school, navigating a public identity built on trauma. Cary watching all of it. The decade that followed was a slow accumulation of losses. Stephen married, had 2 children, built something that looked from the outside like a recovered life. Then in 1989, he was killed in a motorcycle accident on a Merced road at the age of 24. That same year, the NBC miniseries based on his story, "I Know My First Name is Stephen," aired nationally. His kidnapping became a movie. His death became a footnote to his own story. Cary, by then 28, was working a series of manual jobs and quietly unraveling. He had developed a violent fantasy at one workplace, imagining ramming a truck through the building, killing everyone inside, and setting the place on fire. In 1990, his uncle Jesse, with whom Cary had been living, was shot to death inside their shared home with his own shotgun. The murder was never solved. Cary later told investigators that Jesse had molested him as a child, roughly around the time of Stephen's disappearance. In 1991, he attempted suicide with carbon monoxide. In 1995, a breakdown severe enough to require psychiatric hospitalization. He was admitted, treated, and released. No sustained follow-up, no structured support. By the mid-90s, Cary Stayner had survived a brother's abduction, a brother's return, a brother's death, a TV movie about his brother, the unsolved murder of his uncle, a suicide attempt, and a psychiatric crisis. And the world had registered almost none of it. He had been his entire life the boy in the background of someone else's story. In 1997, he found a job that put him somewhere he felt, for the first time, that he belonged.
Before we go any further, we need to stop and spend some time here. Because in cases like this one, it is easy to move quickly toward the crime, the investigation, the arrest, the machinery of the story, and to let the people at the center of it become abstractions, names attached to facts. That is not what this channel does. So, 4 people. Carole Sund was 42 years old, a mother of 4 from Eureka, a coastal city at the northern end of California. She and her 15-year-old daughter Julie had organized the trip specifically to make it memorable for their house guest. Carole was the kind of woman who planned things carefully and made other people feel looked after. There was a photograph taken at Cedar Lodge on the evening of February 15th. Carole and her mother, both of them smiling in the motel room. It was one of the last pictures taken of her. Her husband Jens and their other children were back in Eureka. Her parents were proud of her. She had a life full of people who needed her in it. Juliana Sund, Julie, was 15, a cheerleader at Eureka High School. Just days before the Yosemite trip, she had competed in a cheerleading contest at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. There was a photograph from somewhere inside the park that day. Julie and Silvina, arms around each other, a waterfall behind them, both of them grinning. It looks exactly like what it was. 2 teenagers on a trip that was supposed to be a good memory. Silvina Pelosso was 16, from Cordoba, Argentina. She had come to Eureka the previous year as an exchange student, living with the Sund family for 3 months. During that time, she became close enough to Julie that the two were described as being like sisters. The friendship between the 2 girls mirrored an almost identical story from a generation earlier. Carole herself had once been a U.S. exchange student who had lived in Argentina and had stayed close friends with Silvina's family ever since. Silvina's parents, Raquel and Jose, flew from Cordoba to California during the search. They were staying in Modesto, waiting when the bodies were found.
The trip to Yosemite had been Carole's idea, a way to show Silvina the park before she went home. It was supposed to be a highlight of her American year.
Joy Ruth Armstrong was 26 years old and had been working at the Yosemite Institute for 2 years, teaching children about the natural world. Friends described her as driven and vibrant, the kind of person who would follow up with you about recycling because she was that passionate about what she believed in. Born in Germany and raised in Orlando, she had earned her degree at California State University at Chico before finding her way to a job she loved, bringing children into the park and helping them see it the way she did. That summer, she had climbed to the summit of Mount Shasta and partway up the face of El Capitan. She lived in a remote cabin in the park's Foresta region, with meadow views and Sierra Nevada ridgelines in every direction. On July 21st, she was packing for a trip to visit friends. When she didn't show up, they called the police. 4 people. A mother who organized things so others could enjoy them. A 15-year-old with a trip's worth of photographs still in her camera. A 16-year-old who had come from Argentina to see the country and had found a second family. A 26-year-old who spent her days teaching children to love a park she herself loved. They each came to the same stretch of the Sierra Nevada in 1999, and they each encountered the same man. What none of them knew was that a man who lived on the property had been watching them all day. By the time they turned in for the night, he had already decided.
Cedar Lodge sits 7 miles from Yosemite's Western Gate, on a stretch of Highway 140 that follows the Merced River through a canyon of pine and rock. It is the kind of place you stop for a night on your way to somewhere magnificent. Carole Sund had stopped there before. Stayner had been furloughed from the lodge during the off-season, but he still lived on the property. He had watched the 3 women that day, followed them into the park, watched them hike, watched them return to Cedar Lodge, watched them have dinner in the restaurant, watched them rent a movie from the front desk and go back to their room. As he walked past room 509 that Valentine's weekend, he could see the girls lying in bed and Carole Sund reading a book. There was no man in the picture. The lodge was quiet. There would be no one in the adjacent rooms to hear them if they screamed. At 11 o'clock at night, he knocked on the door. Carole initially refused to let him in, but relented when he said he would get the manager. When he emerged from the bathroom, he pulled a gun. The girls looked up from the film they were watching, Jerry Maguire, and were, according to Stayner's own account, unfazed. He ordered all 3 onto the beds and bound their hands. He put Julie and Silvina in the bathroom. Then he took Carole into the other room. What he did next he described in his confession with a flatness that became one of the most chilling details of the entire case. "I had no feeling," he said, "like I was performing a task." He strangled Carole Sund, carried her body to the trunk of the rental car, returned to the room and sexually assaulted both girls. He strangled Silvina and placed her body in the trunk alongside Carole's. Then he drove Julie, still alive, to a remote overlook near Lake Don Pedro, where he killed her and left her body in the brush. He then called himself a taxi back to Cedar Lodge. The precision of what followed was not panic, it was management. Over the next several days, Stayner made a series of calculated decisions about how to control what investigators would find and where they would look. He drove to Modesto and dropped Carole Sund's wallet, money and credit cards still inside, on a street in a suburban neighborhood. He knew what it would do. Investigators would trace the wallet. They would anchor their theory to Modesto. They would look for people with records in the area. He returned to the rental car days later and set it on fire. On March 18th, a torched car was spotted near Long Barn, California, about 100 miles from Cedar Lodge. The following day, FBI agents arrived and opened the trunk. Carole Sund and Silvina Pelosso were inside, burned beyond recognition, identified later through dental records. Julie was still missing. Then, on March 25th, an anonymous letter arrived at the FBI's Modesto field office. Hand-drawn map, a trail marked from Highway 120 to an X on the shore of Don Pedro Reservoir, and at the top, a line that became the defining statement of Stayner's contempt for the investigation he was watching from the inside. "We had fun with this one." Investigators followed the map. They found Julie Sund's body exactly where the note said it would be. At the same time, the Bureau's focus had settled decisively elsewhere.
The investigation had centered on a group of Modesto men with extensive criminal records, Eugene Rufus Dykes and Michael McLarwick, half-brothers with histories of weapons, drug, and sex offenses. By the end of June, the FBI stated publicly that while no one had yet been charged, it believed those responsible for the killings were already behind bars on unrelated charges. The nation breathed a sigh of relief. They had the wrong men. Meanwhile, Cary Stayner, clean record, cooperative demeanor, motel employee, had been interviewed, released, and at one point asked to help agents collect blanket samples for forensic evidence from the rooms at Cedar Lodge. He did it without hesitation. He was so unremarkable to investigators that they essentially made him part of the investigation. He walked through it with them. 5 months passed. Summer came to the Sierra Nevada. On the morning of July 21, Stayner was driving through Foresta, a remote meadowed community inside the park, when he saw Joy Armstrong outside her cabin. She was loading her car for a trip to San Francisco, walking back and forth, watering her plants. He approached her and, according to his later confession, attempted to put her at ease, asking whether she had ever seen Bigfoot in the area, mentioning that he had once spotted the creature in the fields just beyond her cabin. When he realized she was alone, he pulled the gun. He told her it was a robbery, forced her back inside the cabin, bound her hands and covered her mouth with duct tape, then forced her into the front seat of his truck. What happened next was different from anything that had come before. Joy Armstrong fought. Gagged and bound in the moving vehicle, she managed to open the passenger door and threw herself out onto the road. She got to her feet and ran into the brush along Crane Creek, heading toward a cabin where friends lived several hundred yards away. It was a fight from start to finish, a source close to the investigation told the Los Angeles Times. She tried to get away, and she almost did get away, and those several minutes of struggle left behind a lot of evidence. In his haste, Stayner left behind footprints and the distinctive tracks of his International Scout, which bore a different brand of tire on every wheel. He had none of the control, none of the measured cleanup that followed the first 3 murders. He was sloppy, rushed, and gone. When Armstrong's friends went to her cabin and found signs of a struggle, they began searching. Eventually, investigators found her body near a stream about half a mile away. Her head was in the water several feet further on. A witness then came forward with a description of a pale blue truck seen near her cabin the previous day. Investigators ran the description. Detectives traced the vehicle to Cary Stayner, the handyman from Cedar Lodge. The FBI brought him in for questioning and then released him. At the time, FBI agent James Maddox said publicly that the Bureau did not believe there was a connection between the Armstrong murder and Sund Pelosso case. There was one killer. The FBI had now spoken to him 3 times. Stayner's vehicle had been spotted. His name had come up again, but he was already gone, and he wasn't hiding. He was at a nudist colony eating breakfast.
On the morning of Saturday, July 24, 1999, FBI agents John Bowles and Jeff Ryneck drove to the Laguna del Sol nudist colony in Wilton, California, about 35 miles outside Sacramento. They were looking for a material witness, a man whose vehicle had been spotted near Joy Armstrong's cabin. They were not, at that point, looking for a killer. They found Cary Stayner at the bar, clothed, eating. A woman at the colony had recognized him from news coverage and had already quietly alerted the FBI. When agents approached, he didn't run, he didn't argue. He agreed to ride with them to the Sacramento field office to answer some questions. The drive took about an hour. Ryneck later said he hadn't known what Stayner had done. He didn't judge people before he knew them, so the 2 men just talked. We were 2 guys that didn't know each other. They were stuck doing something that we didn't really want to be doing, and so we were making the best of it, Ryneck recalled. Stayner was calm, personable, easy to talk to. He brought up his brother Stephen, unprompted. He talked about Kenneth Parnell's sentence, 7 years for holding the child captive for 7 years. Ryneck told him he agreed, that it wasn't right. And somewhere in that exchange, something between them shifted into something that felt almost like trust. Colleagues who had encountered Stayner described him as rugged and disarming, the kind of man nobody looks at twice, an outdoorsman, unthreatening. He had held a conversation with the FBI 3 separate times over 5 months. He had never once set off an alarm in anyone who met him. Inside the Sacramento office, agents ordered pizza. They began the interview. Stayner confirmed his guilt almost immediately, remarking that the pizza would be his last meal as a free man. Then, before going any further, he told agents what he wanted in exchange for his full confession. He asked to see child pornography. He said the desire had been gnawing at him his entire life, that he couldn't go to prison for the rest of it and be happy without having seen it. Agent Bowles later recalled his disbelief. Who would go into an FBI office and ask 2 FBI agents to see child pornography? That's not your everyday request. The agents told him no. They expected him to shut down. He confessed anyway. He began with Joy Armstrong, walked agents through it methodically. The approach, the gun, the duct tape, her escape from the moving truck. What happened after? Ronak used his established interrogation method, first asking Stayner to narrate what he did, then going back through again for what he experienced. 3 passes through the same sequence, each one drawing out more. Stayner complied, calmly, without apparent distress. The agents who were present would later describe his manner as entirely flat, as if he were recounting a sequence of ordinary tasks rather than the death of a human being. Then, without being pressed, he kept going. He told them about Carole Sund, about Julie, about Silvina Pelosso. He described room 509, the gun, the binding, the order of events. He led them, eventually, to the knives, still bloodied, that he had used and kept. He directed agents to where he had hidden the weapons he used to kill Joy Armstrong and to cut Julie Sund's throat. Every detail was offered without hesitation. Then he told them where it started, not at Cedar Lodge, not in the years after Stephen's kidnapping, at age 7, in a grocery store in Merced, watching the female cashiers behind their registers, imagining what it would be like to shoot them. He could still describe it, the specific image, the specific store, the specific age. He had been carrying that picture for 30 years. He had held a job, maintained friendships, been employed, been helpful, been cooperative with the very agents now sitting across from him, while that was inside him the whole time, unbroken, undetected, patient in a way that had nothing to do with patience and everything to do with the fact that nobody had ever thought to look. And then, before the session ended, he made one more request. He wanted a television reporter brought in for a jailhouse interview. He wanted his story told. He wanted producers in Los Angeles contacted. He wanted a movie made about his life, the same treatment Stephen had gotten. There had been a miniseries about his brother. He wanted one too. The question at trial wasn't whether Cary Stayner killed 4 women. It was whether he had any meaningful control over what he had become, and the jury had an answer. The federal trial came first because Joy Armstrong had been killed inside Yosemite National Park, federal land. To avoid a possible death sentence, Stayner pleaded guilty to premeditated first-degree murder, kidnapping resulting in death, and attempted aggravated sexual abuse resulting in death. His plea agreement required that he never publicly discuss Armstrong's killing again, that he take that story, as prosecutors put it, to his grave. At the sentencing hearing in November 2000, something unexpected happened. A weeping Stayner turned to face the family and friends of Joy Armstrong and asked for forgiveness. He locked eyes with her mother, Leslie Armstrong, who held his gaze through her own tears. "I wish I could take it back, but I can't," he said. "I wish I could tell you why I did such a thing, but I don't even know myself. I'm so sorry. I wish there was a reason, but there isn't. It's senseless." Leslie Armstrong said afterward that he sounded sincere. "He's devastated. I'm devastated. We're all devastated. I ached for him. I ached for me. I ached for everything." She said there was a possibility she would forgive him someday, that she would not live her life festering with anger. It was one of the most extraordinary statements made by anyone in the entire case, and it came from the woman who had the most reason to say the opposite. Stayner was sentenced to life without parole for Armstrong's murder and transferred to face state charges for the 3 killings at Cedar Lodge. In state court, his lawyers mounted an insanity defense. They did not dispute what he had done. Defense psychiatrist Dr. Jose Arturo Silva spent more than 21 hours interviewing Stayner in jail and reviewed 5 binders of medical history before testifying. He presented a documented pattern of mental illness running through Stayner's family, paraphilia inherited from his father, depression from his mother, layered onto Stayner's own OCD, mild autism, and a childhood of compounding trauma. The defense also presented evidence that in the weeks before the murder, Stayner had been walking around Cedar Lodge mumbling to himself and believed he was receiving messages about an impending apocalypse. The prosecution's argument was simpler. They played the jury his own confession and pointed to every decision he made in the days that followed, each one deliberate, each one designed to redirect the investigation away from himself. A man who could construct that kind of deception in the aftermath of 4 murders was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The planning didn't stop when the killing did. That, the prosecution argued, was the definition of control. Outside experts who examined the case offered a clinical framing that neither fully exonerated nor fully condemned him. Stayner's pathology, they noted, was not sadism in the classical sense. He was not aroused by suffering. What drove him was dominance, the compulsion to exert total control over another person. The distinction matters not because it lessens what he did, but because it explains why he remained functional in the world for so long. He didn't look like the image most people carry of a violent offender. He carried it entirely on the inside. The jury found him sane. On August 27, 2002, Cary Stayner was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. In December of that year, he was sentenced to death and transferred to death row at San Quentin State Prison. Silvina Pelosso's father, Pepe, was present for the verdict. "I always knew he was sane," he said afterward. His confession speaks on its own. The cold way he expressed the killings, there is no doubt. He has been on death row ever since. California has not carried out an execution since 2006. On April 30, 2026, the California Supreme Court denied his appeal unanimously. Chief Justice Patricia Guerrero wrote the 283-page opinion. One justice dissented on the penalty alone, not the verdict, not the finding of sanity, but the sentencing, arguing that errors in the penalty phase rendered the death sentence the product of an unfair proceeding. The majority disagreed. The convictions and the sentence stand. Cary Stayner is 64 years old. He is alive, and the question his case leaves behind isn't really about him. It's about what we missed and why.
4 is the number the record confirms. It is almost certainly not the final count. Investigators have noted that offenders with Stayner's profile typically begin killing at far younger ages, which suggests the crimes that have been documented may represent the end of something, not its entirety. Among the cases that have drawn sustained investigative attention, Patricia Hicks Dahlstrom, 28 years old, who vanished in September 1982 after leaving a religious cult in Merced and was last seen heading toward Yosemite. Partial remains were recovered in the park in 1983. A skull was found nearby in 1988. For nearly 40 years, she was unidentified. In April 2021, genetic genealogy finally gave her back her name. Stayner had attended the 1981 trial of the cult's leader, a man the Stayner and Gibson families knew, and investigators believe he may have targeted Hicks specifically because she had testified against him. Then there is Sherilyn Murphy, 23 years old, whose severed hands were found in a garbage bag on the shore of New Malone's Reservoir in October 1994, and whose headless body was recovered 6 miles away 2 months later. Her head has never been found. The FBI reviewed the case after Stayner's arrest because of the similarities between her death and the killing of Joy Armstrong. And there is the unsolved death of his uncle Jesse, shot with his own shotgun in the home he shared with Cary in 1990. That case remains open. None of these can be confirmed. All of them remain questions. What can be confirmed is this: the system that was supposed to catch Cary Stayner was built around the wrong assumptions. It looked for criminal histories. It looked for prior offenses, known associates, men who had already shown the world what they were. Stayner had none of that. He was employed, cooperative, unremarkable, a man whose violence existed entirely below the surface of everything investigators were trained to read. The profile didn't account for someone like him, and so someone like him moved through it without friction, while 4 women did not. The question of whether his brother's story caused any of this is worth answering carefully, because the easy answer is wrong. Sean Flynn, the journalist who spent years reporting on both brothers, put it plainly. Stephen could have grown up normal, happy, and healthy, and Cary still would have been a serial killer. The abduction of Stephen Stayner was a tragedy. The murders committed by Cary Stayner were a separate tragedy. They happened to the same family. They were not the same story, and collapsing them into one does a disservice to both. Yosemite National Park draws 4 million visitors a year. The waterfalls still fall. The granite is still there. The sequoias that were standing in 1999 are still standing now. Carole Sund is not. Julie Sund is not. Silvina Pelosso is not. Joy Armstrong is not. The system failed to see Cary Stayner until it was too late. The question worth sitting with, the one this case earns, is how many more like him are we not seeing right now?